Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Official 24 channel. Matt presented the DNA results and Victor Newman realized the truth, that the sun standing before him carried his blood. Time itself seemed to lurch, stall, and then surge forward with ruthless force, collapsing decades of secrets, lies, betrayals, and carefully constructed denials into a single, shattering instant that left Victor stunned in a way no boardroom ambush, no hostile takeover, no enemy's bullet or betrayal ever had, for this was not an attack from Jack Abbott or a challenge from Adam, or a moral standoff with Nikki. This was something far more destabilizing, the undeniable proof that the past he had buried had returned with a name, a face, and a heartbeat, and as Matt's hand trembled while holding the envelope, the paper already creased from being folded and unfolded too many times. Everyone in the room felt the pressure crackle like electricity before a storm, because Victor Newman, the man who controlled empires with a look and bent enemies to his will with a word, was suddenly very still, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on that thin sheet of paper as though it were a weapon aimed straight at his chest. And when Matt finally spoke, his voice hoarse but resolute, explaining how the test had been conducted, how the samples had been verified, how there was no room for error, no conspiracy, no manipulation, no Jack Abbott trick hiding in the shadows, the air seemed to thin, making it hard for anyone to breathe, especially Victor, whose entire life had been built on control, certainty, and the belief that he always knew the truth before anyone else did, and yet here he was, blindsided, because the results confirmed a biological connection he had once dismissed as impossible, inconvenient, or better left unexamined. And as Matt slid the paper across the table, Victor did not immediately pick it up, because in that moment he was not the titan of Genoa City, but a man staring at the wreckage of his own choices, flashes of memory slamming into him without mercy, an affair he had justified, a woman he had underestimated, a night he had written off as meaningless, but which had clearly rewritten the future in ways he never imagined. And when his fingers finally closed around the paper, the room seemed to hold its breath, Nikki watching him with wide, searching eyes, torn between loyalty and fear, because she knew better than anyone what Victor did when his world tilted, while Victoria's expression hardened, already calculating the consequences for Newman Enterprises, for the family hierarchy, for her place in it, and Adam, lurking just outside the main circle, felt a familiar knot tighten in his chest, because no matter how many times Victor claimed to accept him, to value him, to see him as a son, the arrival of another Newman heir threatened to reopen old wounds that had never fully healed. And as Victor finally read the results, his eyes scanning the words he could not refute, the truth landed with brutal finality. Probability 99.9%, paternity confirmed, and for a man who prided himself on strength, Victor felt something dangerously close to weakness ripple through him, not because the science was wrong, but because it was right, and it exposed him in a way nothing else ever had, because this son had grown up without him, had lived a life shaped by absence, by unanswered questions, by a mother's silence and a father's shadow, and when Victor finally looked up, his face was unreadable, but his voice, when it came, was lower, rougher, stripped of its usual commanding edge, demanding to know why this had been kept from him, why Matt, or the woman who raised him, had waited until now. And Matt did not flinch, because he had lived with this truth long enough to know that Victor's anger was a shield, not a weapon, and he answered plainly that he had needed to know for himself before turning his life upside down, that he had not wanted Newman money or power or a name, only the truth, and that the truth, now laid bare, belonged to Victor as much as it belonged to him. And that simple statement cut deeper than any accusation, because it forced Victor to confront the reality that this was not a hostile move or a bid for leverage, but a reckoning. And as murmurs rippled through the room, alliances silently shifting, Victor felt the weight of legacy pressed down on him harder than ever before, because his empire was built on bloodlines and succession, on sons and daughters groomed to carry his name forward. And now there was another branch on that family tree, one he had never acknowledged, never nurtured, never shaped, and the implications spiraled outward. Legal ramifications, corporate consequences, media fallout, the inevitable questions from Genoa City's gossip-hungry elite. But beneath all of that noise was something quieter and far more dangerous. The possibility that this son might not want anything from him at all, because Victor could fight enemies, crush rivals, and dominate negotiations. But he had no strategy for earning the respect or forgiveness of a child he had unknowingly abandoned, and as Nikki finally spoke, urging calm, reminding Victor that shock was not an excuse for cruelty, Victor snapped back reflexively before stopping himself, because even he could hear how hollow his bluster sounded, and when Matt met his gaze again, not with hatred but with guarded curiosity, Victor felt something shift, because for the first time in a very long time, he was not the one holding all the cards, and that realization rattled him to his core, and as the room slowly emptied, leaving Victor and Matt facing each other in the aftermath of the revelation, the silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken questions. Would Victor claim him publicly? Would he test his loyalty? Would he try to control him, mold him, or push him away? And Victor, who had always believed that blood defined destiny, now had to face the possibility that destiny might demand something from him in return, and when he finally said Matt's name, tasting it like a foreign language he was only beginning to learn, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes that no one in Genoa City would ever believe if they hadn't seen it themselves, because Victor Newman had just discovered that the greatest shock of his life was not losing power, wealth, or control, but finding a son he never knew he had, a son who stood as living proof that even the most powerful man in the room could be undone by the truth. And as the doors closed behind them and the echoes of that DNA revelation reverberated through Newman Enterprises and beyond, one thing became unmistakably clear. Nothing in the young and the restless world would ever be the same again, because Victor's legacy had just been rewritten. In ink he could not erase, and the consequences of that single sheet of paper would ignite rivalries, expose long-buried secrets, and force Victor Newman to confront not just the son he had gained, but the man he had been, and the man he would have to become. The revelation did not end when the DNA results were read, because in Genoa City truths never land softly. They ripple, they detonate, they infect every corner of every relationship, and once Victor left that room with Matt's existence burned into his consciousness, the aftershocks began almost immediately, stretching far beyond Newman Enterprises and seeping into the lives of everyone tethered to the Newman name. Because Victor, despite his shock, was not a man who retreated, and even as doubt gnawed at him in the quiet moments he would never admit to anyone, his instincts sharpened, pushing him to investigate every detail of Matt's life with the same ruthless precision he applied to corporate acquisitions, ordering background checks, financial audits, discreet surveillance, not because he distrusted Matt's claim anymore. The science had settled that, but because Victor Newman needed to understand the son he never knew, needed to assess whether this young man represented a threat, an asset, or something far more dangerous, an emotional vulnerability. And as reports came in describing Matt's upbringing, his modest achievements, his stubborn independence, Victor felt an unfamiliar ache, because this son had built a life without Newman money, without Newman protection, without the ruthless lessons Victor believed were necessary for survival. And instead of feeling relief that Matt had not grown up broken or bitter, Victor felt unsettled, because it meant that Matt's strength had not come from him, and that realization struck at the core of Victor's identity as a father, even as Nikki struggled to reconcile her empathy with her fear, watching Victor pace late into the night, replaying old conversations, questioning women from his past, wondering who else might have known, who might have kept this secret from him all these years, because betrayal, even unintentional, was something Victor never forgave easily, and yet every time his anger flared, it was followed by a hollow silence, because he could not punish time itself, could not undo the years Matt had spent growing up without a father. And across town, Matt wrestled with his own storm of emotions, because while he had prepared himself for rejection, hostility, or denial, he had not anticipated the complicated gravity of being Victor Newman's son. The sudden way doors opened, glances lingered, and conversations stopped when he entered a room, nor had he expected the subtle shift in how people treated him once whispers began to circulate, because in Genoa City, Bloodlines were currency, and Matt's DNA had just made him wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with money, and yet he found himself resisting the pull of that power, determined not to lose himself to a name he had only just inherited. And when Victor finally summoned him again, this time alone, without lawyers or witnesses or family hovering like vultures, the tension between them was thick, because this was not a boardroom negotiation but something far more precarious, and Victor, after a long silence, offered Matt a place at Newman Enterprises, not as a favor, but as an opportunity, framing it as a chance to learn, to prove himself, to earn what his name implied. And Matt listened carefully, recognizing both the generosity and the test embedded in the offer, because Victor did nothing without an agenda. And when Matt declined, politely but firmly, the rejection hit Victor harder than he expected, because for the first time, someone carrying his blood had refused his power, and that refusal ignited a cascade of reactions throughout the Newman family, with Victoria interpreting it as recklessness, Adam sensing a strange kinship in Matt's resistance, and Nikki urging Victor to slow down, to listen, to consider that fatherhood was not something that could be imposed or strategized into submission. And as days passed, the press began circling, digging for details, speculating wildly about secret heirs and succession battles, forcing Victor to make a choice he had avoided for too long. Whether to acknowledge Matt publicly or attempt to bury the truth to protect the Newman brand, and in a move that surprised even himself, Victor chose transparency, holding a press conference that sent shockwaves through Genoa City, standing before cameras and microphones and confirming that Matt was indeed his son, framing it not as a scandal but as a fact. And while his words were carefully chosen, those who knew him well could see the strain beneath his composure. Because this was not a victory but a confession, and as the fallout intensified, shareholders questioning stability, rivals smelling blood in the water, Jack Abbott watching with barely concealed satisfaction, Victor found himself fighting battles on multiple fronts, defending his empire while navigating an emotional terrain he had never learned to map. And through it all, Matt remained stubbornly grounded, refusing lavish gifts, declining security details, insisting on maintaining his own career and relationships, which only deepened Victor's frustration and fascination. Because this son did not bend, did not beg, did not orbit around Victor's gravity the way others inevitably did, and that independence forced Victor to confront a painful truth, that his legacy was not guaranteed by blood alone, and that respect could not be commanded, even by a Newman. And as tensions escalated, an unexpected crisis erupted when evidence surfaced suggesting that someone had tampered with the DNA test, not to invalidate it, but to expose it, revealing that the results had been leaked deliberately, triggering questions about who stood to benefit from the chaos. And as Victor launched an investigation, suspicion fell on familiar enemies and uneasy allies alike, including members of his own family, forcing long-suppressed resentments to resurface, particularly with Adam, whose relationship with Victor had always been a fragile truce. And when Adam confronted Victor, accusing him of replacing one complicated son with another, the argument exploded with years of bitterness, culminating in Victor admitting, perhaps for the first time, that he had failed all of his children in different ways. And that admission, raw and unguarded, marked a turning point, because it signaled a crack in Victor's armor that could not be unseen. And as Matt witnessed the chaos his existence had triggered, guilt crept in, making him question whether seeking the truth had been a mistake, whether his presence only destabilized lives he had never intended to disrupt. And yet every time he considered walking away, something held him back, not greed or ambition, but the unresolved tension between him and Victor, the unanswered question of whether a relationship could exist beyond DNA and headlines. And when a sudden health scare landed Victor in the hospital, an incident that rattled even his fiercest enemies, Matt found himself at Victor's bedside, not out of obligation but instinct, watching the man who loomed so large in everyone's life reduced to something frighteningly human. And in that quiet room, stripped of power plays and public scrutiny, Victor finally spoke without posturing, admitting that he was afraid, not of dying, but of leaving unfinished business behind, of being remembered only as a tyrant rather than a father. And as Matt listened, The anger he had buried for years softened into something more complex, because while he could not reclaim the past, he could choose what came next. And in that fragile moment, father and son began, tentatively, to bridge the distance between them, not with grand declarations but with honesty, acknowledging the pain, the mistakes, the missed years. And as Victor recovered and Genoa City slowly adjusted to the new reality of Matt Newman's existence, alliances reshaped themselves, power dynamics shifted, and the future of the Newman dynasty grew more uncertain and more compelling than ever, because Matt represented not just a new heir, but a mirror held up to Victor's life, reflecting both his greatest strengths and his deepest regrets. And as enemies plotted, family tension simmered, and the question of succession loomed ever larger. One truth remained undeniable. The DNA results had not merely revealed a son. They had forced Victor Newman to confront the cost of his ambition, the limits of his control, and the possibility that redemption, if it came at all, would not be won through domination, but through connection, patience, and the courage to change. And in a world where power was everything, that might prove to be Victor's most difficult battle yet. As weeks turned into months, the presence of Matt Newman settled into Genoa City like a slow-burning fuse, no longer an explosion but a constant hum of tension beneath every interaction, because even when the headlines faded and the public adjusted to the idea of Victor having another son, the private consequences continued to unfold in quiet, consequential ways, especially within the Newman family, where unspoken comparisons began to surface. How Matt listened more than he spoke, how he questioned rather than commanded, how he carried the Newman name without weaponizing it, and Victor noticed these differences acutely, sometimes with pride, sometimes with irritation, because Matt's refusal to play the expected role challenged Victor's long-held belief that strength only came in one form. And when Victor invited Matt to dinner at the ranch, a gesture both symbolic and fraught, the evening unfolded with strained politeness, memories hovering like ghosts in the hallways, Nikki acting as a gentle mediator while Victoria observed with sharp, analytical eyes, and Adam oscillated between sarcasm and reluctant curiosity. And though no arguments erupted, the silence itself spoke volumes, because Matt did not attempt to ingratiate himself, did not compete, did not claim space that was not offered, and that restraint unsettled everyone, especially Victor, who had built his life around dominance and conquest. And later that night, as Victor stood alone in his study, staring at old photographs of his children, he felt the weight of time pressing down on him, realizing that Matt's arrival had not expanded his empire but exposed its cracks, forcing him to acknowledge that legacy was not measured solely by power or profit, but by the relationships left intact or shattered along the way. And across town, Jack Abbott watched these developments with keen interest, recognizing opportunity in Victor's distraction and vulnerability, subtly maneuvering to exploit divisions within the Newman clan, even as Matt remained deliberately distant from corporate warfare, focusing instead on carving out a place for himself that did not rely on inherited privilege, a choice that earned him quiet respect from some and suspicion from others, because in Genoa City, independence was often mistaken for strategy. And when Victor finally confronted Matt about his refusal to embrace the Newman world fully, accusing him of standing on the sidelines while benefiting from the name, Matt responded calmly but firmly, stating that being Victor's son did not obligate him to become Victor Newman, and that distinction landed with surprising force, because it articulated something Victor had never allowed himself to consider, that his children were not extensions of his will, but individuals shaped by their own choices and consequences. And that realization lingered long after the conversation ended, subtly altering Victor's approach, making him pause where he once would have pushed, listen where he once would have dictated. And though these changes were small and often inconsistent, they marked a shift that did not go unnoticed, particularly by Nikki, who saw in Matt's influence a rare chance for Victor to evolve, to soften without surrendering his strength. And as the Newman family navigated this new normal, the truth became unavoidable. Matt's existence was not a threat to Victor's legacy, but a test of it, and whether Victor Newman would rise to meet that test or be undone by it remained the most compelling question in Genoa City. Because for the first time, Victor's greatest challenge was not an enemy to defeat, but a son who asked nothing more than honesty, respect, and the freedom to define himself, and in a world fueled by power, that might be the most disruptive force of all.